Postmodernity is said to be a culture of fragmentary sensations, eclectic nostalgia, disposable simulacra, and promiscuous superficiality, in which traditionally valued qualities of depth, coherence, meaning, originality, and authenticity are evacuated or dissolved amid the random swirl of empty signals. Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and also good afternoon and good evening to the other parts of the world. When we talk about postmodernism as a literary movement or a specific theory, we tend to associate it with different kinds of fragmentation or truths. As the famous writer John Lyotard has already called it the incredulity towards meta-narrative. In the sense, we do not find any specific or absolute truth. What we have is the relative truth or the fragmented ideas, basically. And to speak more on that and to deal with the postmodern theory specifically, we have our speaker today, Dr. Sanjeev Kumar Goswami. To just brief you all about him, Dr. Sanjeev Kumar Goswami currently serves as the head of the Department of English, Kamrup College, Nalbari, Assam. He also serves as a member of Academic Council, Gauhati University, and is also a key resource person at Gauhati Government of Assam. Moreover, he is also a resource person in the Navodaya Leadership Institute under MHRD, Government of India. Apart from editing books, journals, magazines, he has also authored a book called In Quest of a Successful Career. He has also attended many national and international workshops, conferences as a resource person, paper presenter in different states of India and also abroad. Sir, we are really humbled and honored to host you for the first time, and we greatly look forward to listening to you. Over to you, Sandeep sir.
Thank you, Mr. Vilas Kosik, and the entire team of All India Forum for English Students, Scholars, and Trainers. Thank you for organizing such a lecture series. Today, I do think it is my present privilege to talk on the topic postmodernism in English fiction, or rather, postmodern fiction. Before going to the different aspects of postmodern fiction, let me briefly take some points that what is in fact modernism and what is postmodernism. Many people think that modern means something new, and always basically the two terms, modernism and postmodernism, appears confusing to many people, including and many of us. So first, let us clarify some of those confusions at the beginning. So every people, for the common people, not for the literary students of literature, the common people think that modern means new. And every year, something new becomes old in later periods. But in literature, modernism is both a philosophical movement, it is an art movement that arose from the transformation in Western society during the late 19th and 20th century. So, artists attempt to depart from the traditional art forms of art and which they considered outdated.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, there is a noise coming. It is in a way disturbing, sir. If there is any electrical instrument nearby, please put it aside, sir.
Okay, electrical instrument. My mobile is there. Is it getting clear now?
Most likely because of that, sir. Please put it a little aside.
Okay. Is it clear now? Is it clear now, Avilas?
There is an external noise, sir. No.
Is it clear now?
Yes, sir. It is clear now.
I hope it is clear now.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It is clear now. You can go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much. As I have said, that these two terms, modernism and postmodernism, appears to be confusing to many, and for common people, modern means always new. But in literature, modernism is both a philosophical movement, it's an art movement that arose from the broad transformation in Western society during the late 19th and 20th centuries. But to begin with a lighter vein, even for those who are not, belongs to the Department of Literature, English literature, or for ordinary people even can understand the modern term in a different way. Like if one, I would like to begin with a lighter vein. In fact, if one side of my shirt, if I'm wearing a shirt and one side of my shirt is made of terylene cloth, and the other side is made of tribal clothes of a community, then it is new. It is new because it is modern in the sense that there are two cultural elements in it that is modern. But on the other hand, if my shirt is made of the clothes of several different clothes like terylene, muga silk, and clothes of different tribes, different ethnic communities, then we can say there is a assimilation of different cultures, several cultures, and it is postmodern. And it because as it has multicultural element in it. In fact, the post. In fact, there are the prefix of post. What does the prefix post refers to? I would like to first address to that point. That the prefix post after modernism refers to the after modernism, extend the tendencies already present in modernism, or works out questions and problems implicit in modernism without a break from core assumptions. The term quote unquote post, that means the prefix post before modernism, also refers to contra-modernism, like subverting, resisting, opposing, and also countering features of modernism. And it also refers, the post-term post refers to the historical era following the modern historical time period marker, recognizing cultural, ideological, economic shifts without a new trajectory or privileging of values. It also refers to the aesthetic postmodernism, like hybridization of forms, genres, combining high and low cultural forms and sources, mixing styles of different culture or time period, dehistoricizing and recontextualizing styles in architecture, visual arts, literature, film, and photography. In fact, and again, if we talk about the ism of postmodernism, in fact, in recent years, the ism of postmodernism has without doubt entered the mainstream of literature, both in terms of theory and practice. And though the in the discussion of postmodernism, and more specifically of postmodern fiction, often refers to a succession of supersession of modernism, I'd like to repeat that the post in discussion of postmodernism, and more specifically of postmodern fiction, often refers to a succession or supersession of modernism, and through a set of characteristics to back the term postmodernism, and already a set of characteristics to back the term postmodernism have already been evolved. Yet, we do not have a fixed definition. We do not have a definite definition of postmodernism. It can be best described, postmodernism even today can be best described only as a process. Nevertheless, the term postmodern fiction or postmodern literature itself is used to describe certain tendencies in post-World War II literature. It is both a continuation of the experimentation championed by writers of modern period, relying heavily, for example, on fragmentation, paradox, questionable narrators, etc. I would like to insist on this point that it is both a continuation of the experimentation championed by writers of the modernist period, as they relied heavily, for example, on fragmentation, paradox, questionable narrators, etc. And this postmodernism also is a kind of reaction against Enlightenment ideas implicit in modernist literature. Postmodernist literature, like postmodernism as a whole, is difficult to define, as I've already said. And there is little agreement on the exact characteristics, on its exact scope and and importance of postmodern fiction or literature. However, unifying features often coincide with Jean-François Lyotard's concept of meta-narrative and little narrative, Jacques Derrida's concept of play, Jean Baudelaire's simulacra. For example, instead of modernist quest for meaning in a chaotic world, the postmodern authors assume, often playfully, the possibility of meaning. And a postmodern novel is often a parody of this quest. This distrust of totalizing mechanism extends even to the author. Thus, postmodern writers, the postmodern fiction writers, often celebrate science over craft and employ metafiction to undermine the author's univocal control. Univocal control, I mean the control of only one voice. The distinction between high and low culture is also attacked with the employment of pastiche. The combination of multiple cultural elements, including subjects and genres, not previously deemed fit for literature. So, a list of postmodern authors, postmodern fiction writers often varies. But few common people who write English postmodern fiction who are very well known are Thomas Pynchon, John Barth, Kurt Vonnegut, Joseph Heller, Salman Rushdie, Italo Calvino, Donald Barthelme, Don DeLeo, and Umberto Eco. Dear viewers, I would like to insist again some of the points that I have already raised, that I have already highlighted the fact that it is the postmodernist, however, unifying feature often coincide with those unifying features of postmodernism that we are always, in fact, talk about, in fact, coincide with Jean-François Lyotard's concept of meta-narrative and little narrative, Jacques Derrida's concept of play, and Jean Baudrillard's concept of simulacra. So, modernist quest for meaning, it is a modernist quest for meaning in a chaotic world. The postmodern authors, therefore, I have already mentioned that eschews often playfully the possibility of meaning, and the postmodern novel is often a parody of this quest. With this, I like to go for the differences now to make it more clear, the concepts. I would like to talk about the differences between the modernist concept, the modernism, and the postmodernism. Some differences, like when the modern authors guide and control the reader's response to their work. I'm like to repeat this point, that modern authors guide and control the reader's response to their work. On the other hand, postmodern writers create an open work in which readers must supply their own connections, work out alternative meanings, and provide their own, that means unguided interpretation. So this concept, this difference between modernism and postmodernism regarding the authors, the spaces that the author gives to the readers. In fact, the modern authors guide and control the reader's response to their work. They guide the readers. On the other hand, postmodern writers create an open work in which readers must supply their own connections. So readers have to supply their own connections. They have to work out alternative meaning. They have to provide their own interpretation, and those interpretations are absolutely unguided. Again, postmodernist novel novelist or modern novel mourn the loss of a coherent world. But postmodern novel celebrate and revel in the chaos of an incoherent world. So it is a postmodern novel always, but postmodern fiction always celebrate and revel in the chaos of an incoherent world. On the other hand, when postmodernism sees human experience as unstable, when postmodernist writer, postmodern fiction writer sees internal human experience as internally contradictory, they see human experience as internally ambiguous, internally inconclusive, internally unfinished, fragmented, jagged, with no one specific reality possible. But on the other hand, the modernist writer, modern novel writer, modern fiction writer, they focuses on central themes and a united vision in a particular piece of literature. So that's the basic, the difference lies here, that the modern fiction writer, in modern fiction, we find that this central theme that focuses on the central themes and a united vision in a particular piece of literature. And on the other hand, I would like to repeat these points, that postmodern author, the postmodern fiction writer, they see human experience as unstable. They see human experience as internally contradictory. The postmodern author, they see human experience as ambiguous, inconclusive, indeterminate. They consider human experience as unfinished. It is almost fragment, like human experience they consider human experience as fragmented, jagged with no one specific, and with no one specific reality is possible in postmodern fiction. Again, modern writers, they always attempt to reveal profound truths of experience and life. But postmodernist writer, they're concentrated on suspicious of being profound. While modern authors, modern novel writers, modern fiction writers, they try to find depth and interior meaning beneath the surface of objects and events. Postmodern fiction writer, the postmodernist, prefers to dwell on the exterior image and avoids drawing conclusions or suggesting underlying meanings associated with the interior object and events. So this one is very important because postmodern fiction writer, they prefer to dwell on the exterior image. They prefer to avoid drawing conclusion. They in fact never draw conclusion, and they never even suggest any underlying meaning associated with the interior object and events. It is open to the reader. They have to find the interior meaning associated with the interior object. They have to find the things associated with the interior events, and they have to draw their own conclusions, as I have said already. Again, modernist, I have already mentioned that there is a modern modern fiction writer. They control, they guide the reader's response to their work. But postmodern authors, postmodern author, they create an open space for the reader. The reader is unguided in reading postmodern fictions. So, with this again, I would like to go back to the fact that though postmodernist literature does not refer to everything written in the postmodern period, I beg to say once again that though postmodernist literature does not refer to everything written in a postmodern period, several post-war developments in literature, such as the theatre of the absurd, the beat generation, and magical realism, have significant similarities with postmodern fiction, with postmodern literature. These developments are occasionally also labeled collectively as postmodern. More commonly, some key figures of that period like Samuel Beckett, William S. Burroughs, George Louis Borges, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and there's significant contributors in that way. There are significant contributors to the postmodern aesthetics. They are not directly labeled as postmodern authors. They are significant contributors to the postmodern aesthetics. Indeed, postmodernism in literature is not an organized movement with leaders or central figures. Therefore, it is more difficult to say if it has ended or when it will end, compared to say that declaring the end of modernism with the death of Joyce or Woolf. So it is very difficult to say that if it is ended or when it will end. But arguably, postmodernism peaked in the 60s and 70s with the publication of Catch-22 in 1961, Lost in Farnhouse in 1968, Slaughterhouse-5 in 1969, Gravity's Rainbow in 1973, and many others. So I hope this point is very clear that postmodernist literature, and therefore as such postmodern fiction, is not an organized movement with leaders or central figures in it. But Arguably, postmodernism peaked in the 60s and 70s with the publication of Catch-22 in 1961, Lost in Farnhouse in 1968, Slaughterhouse Pipe in 1969, Gravity's Rainbow in 1973, and many others. Some declared the date of postmodernism in the 80s, with a new source of realism represented and inspired by Raymond Carver. Tom Wolfe, in his 1989 article, Stalking the Billion-Footed Beast, called for a new emphasis on realism in fiction to replace postmodernism. Those who, I hope it is clear, but those who this is not clear, again I will say that some people, some critics in fact have declared the date of postmodernism in the 80s, with a new source of realism represented and inspired by Raymond Carver. Tom Wolfe, in his 1989 article, I'm repeating this point, that in his article entitled Stalking the Billion-Footed Beast. So in that article, Tom Wolfe called for a new emphasis on realism in fiction to replace postmodernism. With this new emphasis on realism in mind, some declared White Noise, that was published in 1985, or The Satanic Verses in 1988 by Salman Rushdie, to be the last great novels of the postmodern era. However, with the continuing publication of many of these authors, and with the success of younger writers such as David Foster Wallace, Dave Eggers, Michael Saban, Zadie Smith, Chuck Palahniuk, Jonathan Lethem, and many others, and with the publication of such as Max Sweeney's The Believer, The Onion, and many others, the declaration of the date of postmodernism is arguably premature. So I can say that even the very trend that the postmodern process is continuing, we cannot say that it is late. Some common themes and techniques of postmodernism are often used together. For example, metafiction and pastiche are often used for irony. These are not used by all postmodernists, nor is this an exclusive list of features. I like to say that though there are some common themes, though there are some common techniques of postmodernism, which are often used by many authors. For example, like metafiction and pastiche are often used for irony. These are not used, I'm repeating this point, that these are not used by all postmodernists, nor is this an exclusive list of features. However, these techniques, these themes can certainly help our understanding of the postmodern process. And so to understand those techniques, those themes, we have to understand some of the concepts that are in fact linked to the very process of postmodernism. And of such concepts that are linked to the postmodernism, we can talk about the elements. As an element, we can talk about that there are elements of irony, that there are elements of absurdity, there are elements of playfulness, and of course, black humor. These elements like irony, absurdity, playfulness, and black humor, they are treating serious subjects as a joke. Why these things are used in postmodern fiction? In postmodern fiction, irony, absurdity, playfulness, and black humor is used just to make a serious subject as a joke, sometimes with emotionally distant authors. Playfulness is central to postmodernism because this playfulness and black humor reinforces the idea that there is no organizing principle in a chaotic world. So I'm telling you that if I belong to the postmodernist and if my father belongs to the modern age, if I consider that my father loved to be in a complex role, but his mindset was very complex, than being a postmodern, my mindset is always in a chaotic world, is always in a problematic mindset. My mindset, the postmodern mindset, is a problematic mindset, while the modern mindset was a complex mindset. So in that case, the playfulness is central to the postmodernism because it reinforces the idea that there is no organizing principle in a chaotic world. There's a question of distrust of theories and ideologies. There's a question of distrust of the author. There's a question of distrust of the narrator. There's a question of distrust of undermining his control of one voice. And there's a question of distrust of modern assumptions about culture, identity, and history. So, this distrust of theories and ideologies, this distrust of the author, that is also maybe also the narrator, undermining his control of one voice, the distrust of modern assumption about culture, the distrust of modern assumption about identity, the distrust of modern assumption about history, they're all elements of postmodern fiction. And to talk about more about the irony, playfulness, and black humor, I would like to, in fact, mention about Linda Hudson. That Linda Hudson claimed that postmodern fiction as a whole could be characterized by the ironic quote marks. That much of it can be taken as a tongue in cheek. So I'm actually quoting Linda Hudson, who claimed that postmodern fiction as a whole could be characterized by ironic quote marks. That much of it can be taken as a tongue in cheek. This irony, along with black humor and the general concept of play, the concept of play in fact related to Derrida's concept of the ideas advocated by Roland Barthes, the pleaser of the text. In fact, this concept of play are among the most recognizable aspects of postmodernism. So the idea of employing these in literature did not start with the postmodernists. They become central features in many postmodern works. In fact, several novelists, later to be labeled as postmodern, were first collectively labeled as black humorists. They were labeled as postmodernists later on, but earlier they were collectively labeled as black humorists. John Barth, Joseph Heller, Kurt Vonnegut, Bruce J. Friedman, and many others. It's common for the postmodernist fiction writer to, as I've already said, to treat serious subjects in a very playful manner, in a very humorous way. And we have a lot of postmodern English fiction writer like Heller, Vonnegut, Pynchon, who addresses the events of the Second World War. And a very good example, I would like to cite that a very good example of postmodern irony and black humor is found in the stories of Donald Bart, The School. For example, Donald Bart, The School, for example, is about ironic death of plants. This Barthelme, The School, in fact, is about ironic death of plants, ironic death of animals, and people connected in one class. But the inexplicable repetition of death is treated only as a joke, and the narrator remains emotionally distant throughout. So I think this example makes the very use of irony, playfulness, and black humor in postmodern fiction makes it clear that, as I have mentioned, that Barthelme's The School is about the ironic death of plants, is about ironic death of animal, is about ironic death of people connected to children in one class. But the inexplicable repetition of death, this inexplicable repetition of death is treated only as a joke, and the narrator remains emotionally distant. He remains emotionally distant throughout. Okay. Anyway, that is one of the very important characteristics that we find in postmodern fiction. Again, another very important characteristic that almost all postmodern fiction shows, in fact, is a pastiche. Pastiche, in fact, is a kind of mixing genres, and pastiche mixing genres as an homage to or a parody of the past literary style. So this, in fact, this element is very common. Is very common in everywhere, every fiction, both postmodern fiction. I would like to give some examples of it. And you'll find that the word pastiche generally means to combine. It means like paste together multiple elements. That is pastiche. In postmodern literature, this can be an homage or a parody of pastiche. It can be also be seen as a representation of chaotic. It can be also seen as a representation of the information branch aspect of postmodern society. The pastiche can also be seen as a representation of the pluralistic society. In fact, the pastiche can be a combination of multiple genres to create a unique narrative or to comment on situation in postmodernity. For example, Margaret Atwood uses science fiction and fairy tales. Umberto Eco uses detective fiction, fairy tales, and science fictions, and so on. Again, William S. Rouse uses science fiction, detective fiction, etc. So, through pastiche commonly refers to mixing of genres. Many other elements are also included. Many other elements, I would like to say that metafiction, temporal distortion are common in the border pastiche in the postmodern novel. Thomas Pynchon includes in his novel elements from detective fiction. Thomas Pynchon includes in his novels from stories from science fiction, war fiction, from songs, from he also makes pop culture references. He also made well-known, obscure and fictional history. Everything is mixed together. So Thomas Pynchon, he mixes everything. He mixes the real, contemporary, and he also makes the historical figures. So with the real contemporary, Pynchon or many other postmodern fiction writer, they mixes up historical figures. And this mixing of a wide variety of well-known, obscure and fictional culture and concept, in fact, that's in fact an example of the elements of postmodern fiction called pastiche. Again, in Robert Coover's his novel, 1977 novel, The Public Burning, Robert Coover mixes historically inaccurate accounts of Richard Nixon, interacting with historical figures and fictional characters such as Uncle Sam and Betty Crocker. So here, in this Public Burning, written by Robert Coover in 1970, into this postmodern fiction also, we find that there's a mixing of inaccurate accounts of Richard Nixon, who is interacting with the historical figures and fictional characters such as Uncle Sam and Betty Crocker. So, pastiche can also refer to compositional technique. Again, I meant to say that pastiche can also refer to compositional technique. For example, cut-up technique employed by Burroughs. There is one novel, postmodern novel, The Unfortunates, written by B.S. Johnson in 1969. And in that novel, it was a really, in fact, the novel is about the releasing of in a box with no building, so that readers could assemble it however they choose. So, this is another example of, in fact, compositional technique that we find in The Unfortunates, the fiction written by B. Johnson in 1969. So another example of, in fact, another technique of that in fact, most of the postmodern fiction writer uses is metafiction. So they employ metafictional technique. Metafictional narrative, in fact, is there on many. It is a very common characteristics of postmodern fiction. So making metafiction is all about making the artificiality of writing apparent to the reader. Metafictional strategies, in fact, that what is the metafictional strategies that the postmodern writers, in fact, adopt. The postmodern writers adopt metafictional strategies, making the artificiality of the writing apparent to the reader. That is, in fact, I meant to say that they employ deliberate strategies to prevent the usual suspension of disbelief. Bring attention to the conventions of literature. So this is metafictional strategies employed by many of the postmodern, in fact, fiction writers. What they do, I like to repeat that they employ a deliberate strategy to prevent the usual suspension of disbelief. And they do it. In fact, this suspension of disbelief is made to draw the attention to the convention of literature. So, metafiction, in fact, is essentially writing about writing or foregrounding the apparatus, making the artificiality of art or the fictionality of fiction apparent to the reader. Generally disregards the necessity for willing suspension of disbelief. So this term, willing suspension of disbelief, is very important, and it is done through metafictional strategies and by most of the postmodern fiction writers. So I'm repeating this point that the metafiction is essentially writing about writing. It is writing about writing or foregrounding the apparatus. That means making the artificiality of art or the fictionality of fiction apparent to the reader, and generally disregards the necessity for willing suspension of disbelief. In fact, it is very often employed to undermine the authority of the author. For unexpected narrative shift, it is employed to advance a story in a unique way. These metafictional strategies are employed for emotional distance. These metafictional strategies are employed to comment on the act of storytelling. So, these metafictional strategies is, in fact, the success of a postmodern fiction, I believe, in fact, depends on this strategy of metafiction, how they use the strategy of metafiction in their novel. Because Thomas Pynchon, Umberto Eco, all they employed this technique to undermine the authority of author. They employed this technique to undermine the authority of author. They undermine the strategy of metafiction to advance a story in a unique way. They employ the technique of metafiction for unexpected narrative shift. If there is an unexpected narrative shift, they will be immediately using this again, the metafictional strategies, and for making and to maintain the emotional distance or to comment on the act of storytelling. They also use these metafictional strategies in postmodern novel. Kurt Vonnegut commonly used this technique. The first chapter in his 1969 novel, Slaughterhouse-Five, is about the process of writing the novel and calls attention to his own presence throughout the novel. Though much of the novel has to do with Vonnegut's own experience, during the firebombing of Dresden, Vonnegut continually points out the artificiality of the central narrative arc, which contains obviously fictional elements such as aliens and time travel. In 1999, we find another novel, postmodern novel, The Thing They Carried by Tim O'Brien. And this novel, postmodern novel, The Thing They Carried by Tim O'Brien, is about one platoon's experience during the Vietnam War. And in the things they carried, O'Brien features a character named Tim O'Brien. Though O'Brien was a Vietnam veteran, the book is a work of fiction, and O'Brien calls it into question the fictionality of the characters and incidents throughout the book. In one story in the book, How to Tell a True War Story, questions the nature of telling stories. So, factual retellings of war stories, the narrator says would be unbelievable and heroic. Moral war stories don't capture the truth. So, all these are in fact narrated by employing metafictional strategies by these authors. There is also a techno-culture or hyper-reality in metafiction, in postmodern fiction. Roles and characters inundated with information, focused on technology in everyday life, swamped by products and bombarded by advertising, ambiguity of what is real, what is simulated. This techno-culture and hyper-reality is also, we can find this element of techno-culture and hyper-reality also in postmodern fiction. Because, as I have already mentioned, that as of now, the roles and characters in those postmodern pictures are inundated with information. Those mostly these novelists are focused on technology in everyday life, or they are experienced with the technology in everyday life. They're swamped by the products and bombarded by advertising, ambiguity about the real world, about ambiguity about what is real and what is simulated. So there is another point called what we can say that historiographic metafiction. In fact, the term is not used by all, but in fact it was first used by Linda Hudson, and in fact Linda Hudson coined the term historiographic metafiction. Linda Hudson in fact used the term historiographic metafiction to refer to the works that fictionalizes the actual historical events or figures. For example, we have Marquez, the general in his labyrinth. We have the postmodern fiction like Doctors, Yale Doctors, Ragtime, where in fact we will find the many students finds it is there in the syllabus of many universities. Those who have read it, they will find that this Yale Doctors, Ragtime, which features such historical figures as Harry Houdini, Henry Ford, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. They are all historical figures, and again you will find that another writer like John Fowles deals similarly with the Victorian period in the French Lieutenant's Woman. So these are all, we can say, historiographic metafiction. And this term was particularly coined by Linda Hudson, and this term is also used to characterize the characteristics of the postmodern fiction. There's a very interesting element in postmodern fiction that we can call it maximalism. So, maximalism and minimalism. In most of the postmodern fiction, English postmodern fiction, we find that sprawling canvas and fragmented narrative that is looking disorganized and filled with playful language for its own sake. This is maximalism in postmodern fiction. Like even the language that you will find dot, 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 dot. You will find quote, unquote. You will find so many slashes. You will find he oblique C, oblique they. Right? So, oblique, infinite, dashes, slashes. They are all used even in language, in postmodern fiction. So even in this is this quality, this characteristics, I might say that this covers under the word maximalism. This is a kind of sprawling the canvas and fragmented narrative that is looking disorganized and filled with playful languages. For instance, very often when you find three dots after a poetry, after some quotation or after a speech, we think what these three dots mean. In fact, those dots, those dashes, and so many slash marks, they characterize the postmodern fiction. They characterize the postmodern writing because it is open to you, because they are disorganized. They are, in fact, open for the reader to interpret. They have no close ending. And wherever there is no close ending, the writers, postmodern writers, uses ... They use slashes. They use so many hyphens. Again, exactly opposite to the maximalism, they also postmodern, in fact, adheres to minimalism. Like short, slice of life stories. Slice of life, not the full life. Slice of life stories where readers have to use their own imagination to create a story. While you'll find maximalism through sprawling canvas and fragmented narrative that is looking disorganized and filled with playful language for its own sake. In postmodern fiction, you will also find minimalism. Especially in English fiction, you'll find minimalism because they talk about slice of life stories, not the full story. So slice of life stories where readers have to use their own imagination to create the story. The postmodern writers, the postmodern fiction writers, they're not creating a story for you. They're creating only slice of life stories. And it is up to the reader that they have to interpret, they have to use their own imaginations to create the story. Unexceptional characters are very important. In fact, there are minimum of the minimum characters are used. So many in postmodern fiction writers, so many postmodern uses minimum characters, but unexceptional characters they use a lot. And again, another important thing about that we included minimalism, characters of minimalism is that there is an economy with words, spare style, lacking adjective, lacking adverbs, and meaningless details. So, in fact, even that's in most romantic fictions, you will find too many details, too many adjectives, too many adverbs, and too many styles. But postmodern fiction, English postmodern fictions, most of them are, in fact, they have a spare style, they lack adjective, they lack adverb, and they lack, most importantly, meaningful details. Because everything they would like to present economy words. So if I'm reading a novel and I have to judge it, whether it is a postmodern novel or a modern novel or a romantic novel, these characters help us to, in fact, immediately find out that if everything is left to the reader, if the fiction writer is not speaking all the detail and leaving it to the reader mostly, we are reading a postmodern fiction to a great extent. Because as I have said one again in case of minimalism and maximalism, in fact in minimalism they are using the slashes, the hyphens, dot, and those are in fact some of the important characteristics of postmodernism. Now I would like to talk about another important characteristics, which is called temporal distortion. In fact, this temporal distortion is a common technique in postmodernist English, postmodern English fiction. Historiographic metafictions that we have already discussed is an example. Is also example of temporal distortion. Distortions takes place in time. Distortion takes place in central features. For example, Kurt Vonnegut's many non-linear novels, you will find that there is a distortion in time, there is a distortion in central features, and Slaughterhouse 5 in Flight to Canada, Samuel Reed, they all playfully deals playfully with anarchism. And this common technique of modern fiction that I have already mentioned, that the temporal distortion, in fact, in postmodern fiction, it uses a variety of ways. And there, this temporal distortion is used for the sake of, only for the sake of irony. Now, let's go to another aspect that's called paranoia. Perhaps demonstrated most famously and effectively in the work of Thomas Pynchon, the sense of paranoia, the belief. Paranoia is the belief that there is an ordering system behind the chaos of the world. So, what is paranoia? That we find in Thomas Pynchon, in the work of Thomas Pynchon, mostly, it is a belief that there is an ordering system behind the chaos of the world. And for the postmodernist fiction writer, no ordering system exists. So a search for order is fruitless. But anyway, theories, as I have said, that temporal distortion event talks about events can overlap. By temporal distortion, events can overlap, events can repeat, or multiple events can occur simultaneously, often to achieve irony. But paranoia, the belief that there is an ordering system behind the chaos of the world. For the postmodernists, I'd like to repeat that there is no ordering system exists. No ordering system exists. So search for, if you want to search for an order, it is always meaningless. It is always fruitless. It is always absurd. And then magic realism, the technique of magic realism is used in postmodern fiction so that the imaginary themes and subjects with a dreamlike quality, mixing the real with a fantastic, surreal and bizarre. These concepts are sometimes appears to be in fact confusing with other concepts, but magic realism is very simple to understand. It's a very simple concept to understand in that sense that it is in fact imaginary themes and subjects with a dreamlike quality, mixing the real with a fantastic, surreal and bizarre. So mixing the real with the fantastic, mixing the real with the surreal, mixing the real with the bizarre, it is magic realism. Time shifts, dreams, myths, and fairy stories as part of the narrative. Inexplicable events, elements of surprise and abrupt shock. These elements, in fact, constitute the concept called magic realism, and this magic realism is the technique of magic realism is employed heavily by postmodern fiction writers. Intertextuality. the quotations, reference, allusions, designed to make apparent that literary text absorbs and transforms some other text somewhere. That element is also found. You will find in postmodern fiction. But I would like to say that there is some different perspective of postmodern process as well. Like John Bart, the postmodern novelist who talks often about the label postmodern, wrote an influential essay in 1968 called Literature of Exhaustion. And in 1979, he wrote Literature of Replacement in order to clarify the earlier essay. Now I'd like to just say, once again, I'm telling you that now I'd like to talk about some different perspective on postmodern process, and that process is in fact, I'd like to mention first the John Bart. So John Bart, he in fact was a postmodernist novelist and who often talked about the label postmodern. And in his influential essay of 1968, Literature of Exhaustion, and another essay, Literature of Replacement, written in 1979, and in Literature of Replacement, he in fact clarified the points he made in earlier essay. In Literature of Exhaustion was about the need for a new era in literature after modernism had exhausted itself. So, Literature of Exhaustion was about the need for a new era in literature after modernism had exhausted itself. In Literature of Replacement, Pastiche, I would like to quote, "My ideal postmodernist author neither merely replicates nor merely imitates either his 20th century modernist parents or his 19th century pre-modernist grandparents. He has the first half of our country under his belt, but not on his back. Without lapsing into moral or artistic simplism, shoddy craftsmanship, medicine avenue sensuality, or either false or real naivety, he nevertheless aspires to a fiction more democratic in its appeal than such late modernist marvels as Beckett's Takes for Nothing. The ideal postmodernist novel will somehow rise above the quarrel between realism and irrealism, formalism and contentism, pure and committed literature, couture fiction and young fiction." So that was a quote that I have made from John Bart's Literature of Replacement. In fact, many of the well-known postmodern novels deal with Second World War. One of the most famous of which is being Joseph Keller's Catch-22. And Heller claimed his novel and many other American novels of the time had more to do with the state of the country after the war. The anti-war and anti-government feelings in the book belong to the period following the Second World War, the Korean War, the Cold War of the 50s. A general disintegration of belief took place then, and it affected Catch-22 in the form of the novel and the form of the novel also became disintegrated. So Catch-22 was a collage, if not in structure, then in the ideology of the novel itself. Without being aware of it, without being aware, so we have to, without even being, we'll get to know, without being aware, we are aware that Catch-22 was a collage, and a perfect example of postmodern fiction, English fiction. Novelist and theorist Umberto Eco explains his idea of postmodernism as a kind of double quote. I would like to quote Umberto Eco. "I think of the postmodern as that of man who loves a very cultivated woman and knows that he cannot say to her, 'I love you madly,' because he knows that she knows that these words have already been written by Barbara Cartland. Still there is a solution. He can say, as Barbara Cartland would put it, I love you madly. At this point, having avoided false innocence, having said clearly it is no longer possible to talk innocent, he will nevertheless say what he wanted to say to the woman that he loves her in an age of lost innocence. There are many things to cover, but finally I would like to say that postmodernism can be used at least in two ways. First, to give a label to the period after 1968, which should then encompass all forms of fiction, both invocative and traditional. And secondly, to describe the highly experimental literature produced by writers beginning with Lawrence Durrell and John Fowles in the 1960s, reaching to the breathless works of Martin Ains, Amish, and the chemical generation of the fin de siècle. In what follow? So many questions creep in our mind about the very nature of postmodern process. And one of the most important is about the politics involved, or more simply, is the movement towards fragmentation. Provisionally, performance and instability is something good or something bad. There are various answers to that in our contemporary society. However, desire to return to the pre-postmodern era, I mean to say modern humanist enlightenment thinking. In fact, this desire to return to the pre-postmodern era tends to get associated with the conservative, political, religious, and philosophical groups. In fact, one of the consequences of postmodernism seems to be the rise of religious fundamentalism as a form of resistance to the questioning of grand narratives of religious truths. This is perhaps most obvious to us in the US anyway, in Muslim fundamentalism in the Middle East, which ban postmodern book like Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses, because they deconstruct such grand narratives. This association between rejection and postmodernism and conservatism or fundamentalism may explain in part why the postmodern avowal of fragmentation and multiplicity tends to attract liberals, tends to attract radicals. This is why, in part, feminist theorists have found postmodernism so attractive, as Sarup, Flax, Butler all point out. On another level, postmodernism seems to offer some alternative to joining the global culture of consumption, where commodities or forms of knowledge are offered by forces far beyond any individual's control. This alternative focus of thinking of any and all action as necessarily local, limited, partial, but nonetheless effective. By discarding grand narratives and focusing on specific local goals, postmodernist politics offer a way to theorize local situations as fluid, unpredictable, though influenced by global trends. Hence, the motto of postmodern politics might be think globally, act locally, and don't worry about any grand scheme or master plan. I'd like to say that once again, I will repeat this point, that by discarding grand narratives and focusing on specific local goals, postmodernist politics offer a way to theorize local situations as fluid and unpredictable, to influence by global trends. Hence, the motto for postmodern politics might well be think globally, act locally, and don't worry about any grand scheme or master plan. So I would like to quickly now sum up my points of view on the postmodern process. That though in fact there is no final stance, I might have to say that there is no final stance on the process of postmodernism. There are broad ranges. Yet postmodernism refers to postmodern fiction, refers to the modernism, especially refusal of some of the totalizing premises and effect, and of the implicit or explicit distinction between between high culture and commonly lived life. Response to such things as a world live under nuclear threat and threat to the geosphere, to a world of faster communication, mass-mediated reality, greater diversity of cultures and mores, and a consequent pluralism. It refers to the acknowledgements and of, in some sense, struggles against a world in which, under spreading technological capitalism, all things are commodified and made objects of pleasure, and in which genuine experience has been replaced by simulation and spectacle. So again, we find resultant senses of fragmentation in postmodern fiction. We find resultant senses of discontinuity, of reality as a patch rather than a wave. Again, in postmodern fiction, we'll find, or postmodern literature, we'll find reconceptualization of society, history, and the self as cultural construct and as rhetorical construct. With these words, I'd like to thank everyone for listening to me. It's a very broad concept, and maybe some other day I'll be explaining all the other points. For today, thank you so much. Over to Vilas.
Thanks a lot, sir. Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you so much. You have explained in a very lucid manner a really difficult concept. We all agree that postmodernism, if we consider both as a theory and a literary movement as well, it is quite tough in terms of not understanding it properly, or in terms of not able to find something specific or concrete as such. But the way you delineated step by step, or delineated every aspect to make us understand, it was really commendable, sir. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Now, sir, we'll move ahead to the questions which we already have. I will be reading them out to you, sir. Yeah, we have our first question from Mr. T. He says, what are the main postmodern features with reference to the current period? Name some writers and also some works, please.
Okay. Current period, I believe. Can you repeat
Postmodern
the
period, sir.
Okay.
21st century.
Okay. Well, first of all, the characteristics already I have mentioned. What are the characteristics I have already mentioned? I would like to, I do not like to repeat them, but simply I would like to, for his appraisal, I would like to say that it's a postmodernism. In fact, is a kind of responses to modernism, especially refusal of some kind of totalizing premises and effects, and of this implicit and explicit distinction between high culture and the commonly lived life. Again, another characteristic is responses to such thing as a world live under nuclear threat to the geosphere, to a world of faster communication. In fact, these things already I have mentioned, but what I like to mention now, in fact, is that postmodern fiction, in fact, parodies of all sorts of meta-narrative and master code elements, including genre of literary form. The challenging borders and limits, including those of decency. Another characteristic is the exploration of marginalized aspects of life and marginalized elements of society. A sense that life is lived in a world with no transcendent warrant. The writing of reflexive or metafiction. A reaction to refusal and totalizing of the modernist form. And so on. Already I have mentioned them, but for example, as you have asked me to cite some examples, I'd like to cite those examples. That there is a long list, in fact. In fact, there's a long list still. I'd like to mention some of them. That if you talk about the really this 100 Years of Solitude by Mark Page, 2017, you'll find that many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Mahdieh was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. I will not go to the details of the novel, but simply I'm just mentioning them, that you should go through the 100 Years of Solitude of by Marquez, that is published in 2017. It's a very good example of postmodern fiction. Another example that I've studied, The Unfortunates by B.S. Johnson, that was published in 1969. In fact, is a very interesting one. Another one, The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, 1980. I think it should be read by everyone to get to know about the characteristics, whatever the characters we have discussed now. You will find most of the characteristics in this novel, The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, that was published in 1980. Another book, The Satanic Verses, though you may not get it in market, you may read, at least you have read The Midnight Children. There are many by Salman Rushdie, and almost all of them are, in fact, we can label them as postmodern fiction. This Satanic Verses, in fact, though no in modern times, no book has matched the uproar sparkled by the Salman Rushdie Satanic Verses. In fact, which earns its author a death sentence. Further aside, it is a marvelously erudite study of good and evil, and a feast of language served up by a writer, and a hate of his powers, and a rollicking comic fable. And I'm sure most of you have read Salman Rushdie's another novel, The Midnight Children. And by Don DeLeo, you will find The White Noise. In fact, that's a very interesting postmodern fiction that was written in 1985. Another postmodern fiction by Thomas Pynchon is Gravity's Rainbow, that was written in 1973. Another one, I'd like to give an example of Lost in the Farmhouse by John Barth, that was 1968. Another one, Catch-22, already I have mentioned about the Catch-22. There's a very, very interesting by Joseph Heller. And about this Catch-22, in my lecture itself, I have mentioned that set in the closing months of the Second World War, in an American bomber squadron of coast of Italy. Catch-22 is the story of a, in fact, bomb rider named as Yoserin, who in fact is a frantic and furious because thousands of people he has never even met kept trying to kill him. So I believe that Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, that was published in 1961, is a very, very good example of postmodern fiction, where if you go through this, the characters that I have mentioned about postmodern fiction, you will get to know about, you will get a first-hand instance by reading Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. Another I would like to mention is by John Hawkes, The Cannibal, that was in fact the very beginning, 1949, and that's very interesting postmodern fiction. And the list, in fact, is a lot. In fact, in 1970s, you will almost by the period of 1970, you will almost by more than 42 novels, postmodern fiction again. In 1980s, we will have more than 37, almost 40 novels. You will find that they are, in fact, having good rank. Almost most of them have got prizes in different forums. In 1990s, you will find in the recent time you will find more than 40 novels. Again, even in 2000. In the period of 20s, you will find more novels still in the line of postmodern fiction are being written. Even the recent novel, like you will find that even after 2020, you will find in 2010 there is a novel by Joshua Cohen, which he was an American novelist and story writer, and who is known, in fact, another novel, even recent novel, you will find in 2017 by George Saunders, Lincoln in the Prado. So George Saunders is again an American writer who, in fact, this novel, like Lincoln in the Prado, is a very good example of a very recent example of postmodern fiction. And if you go back again to the previous to the early period, you will find the early postmodernist novel is, in fact, we can say that there is John Hawkes, The Cannibal, in fact, can be labeled as an early postmodern novel. And in fact, I would like to conclude by saying that even in this novel by George Saunders, Lincoln in the Bardo, is a very recent postmodern novel which have been wide acclaimed. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Harshini D'Souza madam says, sir, how did postmodernism affect literature in general?
Postmodernism, I can affect literature in general, you cannot say, because every, in fact, even in this period, postmodern literature, even in the postmodern period, general literature, they are not disallowed. Literature, even today, some people are writing romantic literature. Even today, the trends that we find in the Victorian period still continues. So, postmodernism if I say that the postmodernism have affected the general literature, it will not be just for us to say that it has affected general literature. But yes, postmodernism has given us a new trend. Postmodernism has given us a new trend in the sense that there is a crushing sense that there is nothing new to create. That is the problem. Because potential problem with postmodernism, I think, is that in fact goes that disturbs the madam says that it has an impact disturbed the general literature. I must say that only one point that I find that there is a crushing sense that there is nothing new to create. Because postmodernism in fact employs there are so many cultural elements they take. In fact, already have said regarding when I was describing the characteristics of postmodernism, I have mentioned already that in fact it is not one. It takes many forms to make it postmodern. So, crossing sense that there is nothing new to create. That is, in fact, creates some little problem for the for general literature. A focus on the dystopian narrative without suggested avenues for avoiding the dystopia. There is in postmodernism you will find a stylistic marks without content, the meaning in the mimicry, and I think this stylistic marks without content, to some extent, for general readers, it affects the general literature because the stylistic marks without content that we find in postmodern fiction, in fact, disturbs the meaning, and the meaning we find only in the mimicry. Thank you.
Sanatabasam Madam says, how the postmodern fiction justify itself in reflecting the socio-cultural aspect of society?
Postmodern, as I have said already, that it justifies because the age that it comes after modernism, that age that it witnessed. In fact, postmodernism is not just something. It was also a continuation of modernism in that sense that already we have the metaphysics. Mix, in fact, the heterogeneous ideas are yoked together by violence. That Muru's metaphysics are there; those are accepted by, in fact, the modernist writers, and also they are also, in fact, influence the postmodernist writers. And in that sense, I believe that it reflects the culture that we are going through because it is a global culture. It is, in fact, the multicultural. Now it is a time of, in fact, rock, time of pop. In fact, the pop music, in fact, if you find some the multicultural elements, those cultures are all amalgamated, those cultures are all integrated and making a fusion. And that fusion, in fact, gives us the postmodern. And we are now in a global world. So in this global world, the culture of South Africa, the culture of India, the culture of any other countries, there is a fusion. And it is a common thing that we have to accept, and it has in fact affected the literature as a whole and the society. We are no more now. We can no more say that we are Indian only in culture. Yes, we are Indian in culture, but we are also used or accustomed to different cultures. They are even in our own culture, there is already a mixing of different cultures. So it is this way the postmodern has affected our own cultures.
Zuriti Goswami Madam says, what is the most striking feature of postmodernism that we can see in Indian drama?
In Indian drama, the most striking feature we see, in fact, is the absurdity, the meaninglessness. In fact, already I have said that the very characteristic, in fact, there is no meaning. The dramatists, they do not give any meaning. In fact, it is up to the reader that they have to find meaning that whatever they've been projected, whatever they have witnessed in the drama. So the most important character is that there is absurdity, and in fact, there is no meaning in it. Meaning, there is meaning in it, but there is no meaning as proposed by the dramatist for the viewers. The viewers have to interpret their own meaning. by witnessing the drama. That is, I think, the most interesting aspect of postmodern.
Mr. Rajiv Saha says, please illustrate the postmodern features in Assamia Sahitya.
Postmodern features in Assamese. Yeah. In fact, you'll find postmodernism, when you say that modernism in Assamese would begin with Hamburwa. When you say modernism, I'm saying not postmodernism, I'm saying modernism. When he wrote Momotar City by saying, by quoting Azira Pound, if we're coming down to the narrows of the river Yang, please let me know beforehand. I'll come out to meet you as far as sound. Like, if you therein, from there, in fact, the modernism begins in Assamese poetry, and also like in drama, novel, there are so many writers who are in fact having postmodern elements in it. Like for instance, if you go for Ahar, Arun Sharma's Ahar, postmodern drama, you will find it is absolutely everything is static, nothing progresses in that drama. Again, even Hiruda's poetry, Hiren Bhattacharya's poetry, most of them, in fact, when you say you have to find meaning in it, he is not giving us meaning. So Ajit Borua, he is in fact one of the topmost. He writes everything in, of course, in postmodern way. Thank you.
Mr. Yazir Parayal says, is there any reference to the end of postmodernism? What will we have once postmodernism ends?
Yeah. Yes. I have. It is very. I have already mentioned it. It is. You cannot say. It will be very premature to say that to declare the date of postmodernism. In fact, it is a process. The postmodern, it is a process, so we cannot declare. I have already mentioned to you that, in fact, many people have declared date. It depends on many critics. Some critics have already declared date of the the last one. Already have mentioned that some of them have like with the Umberto Eco. With in fact some of the even Salman Rushdie's satanic verses, they call that that is the final novel written in the trend of postmodernism. But those arguments are premature because with the continuing publication of many of these authors in the trends of postmodernism, and with the success of younger writers, now they're coming up like David Foster, like Dave Eggers, Michael Claiborne, J.D. Smith, like Jonathan Letme, and many others who are writing recently in the trend, in the very process, that the process called postmodern process. They are still continuing writing. So it is very premature for me. I believe that it is to declare that there is a date of postmodernism. It is premature to declare.
Pratiksa Alaman Madam says, does postmodernism also intersect with the idea of post-colonialism?
To a great extent, yes. To a great extent, yes. Because in fact, after that, when you see the colonial period, when everything depends on the society, reflects writers, their text elements only from society, and the colonial period was British had these colonies everywhere in the world, and so the post-colonial period, in fact, when we had post-colonial period when we had in India, but you may not have a post-colonial period in England. That's the main point. But postmodernism, in fact, when in many novels you will find, though it is reflected after the Second World War, yes, I believe that there are elements of post-coloniality in postmodern fiction as well.
Aditi Madam says, please suggest us some readings of postmodern writings in Indian context.
Okay. In Indian context, there is a. It's very difficult to suggest a list as such, but still, I must say that Indian in India we have so many postmodern works. Like, Bibhash Choudhury, he's a novelist and he's a diplomat who served in Turkey. He writes, in fact, Six Suspects, The Accidental Apprentice. His debut novel was their question Q&A, that means question and answer. This tells the story of how a penniless waiter in Mumbai becomes the biggest quiz show winner in a history. So, and in fact, you can say, like, I can tell you about a recent novel about Boman Desai's The Memory of Elephants that was published in 1988. Esther David's The Wallet City, The Memory of Elephant by Fakrud Handis, Gautam Bhatia's Short Story of Everything. There is another one, Zain Ibkar's very interesting one that I'd like to suggest is Come Rain, that was published in 1993. I would like to suggest Manoj Das, A Tiger at Twilight. It's a very, very good postmodern fiction that is of Indian context, written by Indian author. A Tiger at Twilight, that is by Manoj Das. You can even Markan Punjab is An Angel of Pyjamas. Like, you can read for Pankaj Mishra's The Romantics, the P.V. Narasimha Rao's The Insider. You can find Raja Kamal Jha's The Blue Bedspread, and another one by R.K. Laxman, The Messenger. One, I think that I must suggest this one, that everybody should read The Messenger by R.K. Laxman. And also, there is one by R.W. Desai, The Name is Woman. That was, in fact, a little earlier, 1993 it was published. But I would like to also suggest that you should go through this one, Thy Name is Woman. Frailty, Thy Name is Woman by R.W. Desai. So go for this. Mohita Nair, definitely you will always love to hear. Hiran Nagarka, Hira Trivedi, they're all, even Mohandeep, they're all good novelists. Preeti Senoy, they're all good novelists of belonging to who are belonging to India. I'm not naming all the famous ones. I'm naming those who are in fact upcoming and those who are in fact really very good. And rest, I think you know all.
Dipsika ma'am says, please tell us the difference between the narrators in modern and postmodern fiction.
This thing already I have mentioned during my narrator. In fact, is a very important role. In postmodern, I have this difference is very, very. You will find that the focus in modernism, in modern novel, you will find that the writer creates an open work. Modern authors do not guide. Modern authors they guide, they control the reader's response to their work. In fact, the narrator, they guide, they control the reader's response to their work. But narrator in postmodern novel, they create an open space. They create an open work in which the reader must supply their own connections. The reader must supply their own alternative meanings, and they provide their own unguided interpretation. So, in fact, they try to find out the depth and interior meaning beneath the surface and objects of the event in modern fiction. And in postmodern fiction, the narrator, in fact, shows that they prefer to dwell on the exterior image and avoids drawing conclusions. And the narrator do not suggest underlying meaning associated with the interior object and events in postmodern fiction. But the narrator in modern fiction, they tries to find out the depth of the interior meaning, which we do not find in postmodern fiction. Thank you.
Yes, sir. We have another question by Rashmi Verma, madam. She says, Does the postmodernist writer write to entertain or to convey something?
Yes, see, it's a very interesting question, I believe. Postmodernist writers write to convey some meanings or to entertain. In fact, post for me, what I understand, in fact, is this. In fact, entertainment, because they use, in fact, the characteristics like, the irony, black humor, we may call it, they may entertain. But under it, there is a deep sense of meaning. There is a message they leave to judge by the reader of postmodern fiction. Definitely they are entertaining, but entertainment is not the only thing that the postmodern fiction try to in fact give to the reader. Entertainment, not just for the sake of entertainment. Entertainment to hide meaning, to explore more. So I believe that postmodern fiction writers always has a message to give to you, but they do not directly give you the message. The postmodern fiction writers give you the message indirectly. They leave upon you. They leave the message to you to understand, to draw your own conclusions. But yes, they leave a message, and the message is to be, the conclusion of the message is to be drawn by the reader, by those who read it. Thank you.
Sanjukta Madam says, can a single text have more than one style?
Why not? A single text can have more than one style. And in fact, in postmodern fiction, nobody is, in fact, most of the authors are, in fact, not just following one style. The multiplicity of styles, in fact, one of the characteristics of postmodern fiction. In fact, they celebrate, in fact, if you go for the one thing, in fact, if you go for only for one style, in fact, you are going for a coherent work. And postmodern fiction, in fact, never goes for a, in fact, while modernist novel mourn the loss of a coherent world, postmodernist novel, or in fact, they enjoy the using of different style. They celebrate and revel the chaos of a coherent world, and the chaos comes because of the different styles. Thank you.
Dr. Seema Shukla Madam says, sir, please throw some light on the difference between negative capability and willing suspension of disbelief.
So, willing suspension of disbelief. So, already I have mentioned that willing suspension of disbelief, in fact, the most common term that postmodernism uses. Not uses, they in fact employ it in their novel. So, what we say that willing suspension of disbelief, something they do not, in fact, believe it. They believe it, but they do not wish to believe it. That is willing suspension of disbelief. And actually, and what else is it, Tisha?
Negative capability, sir.
In fact, it is also called willing suspension of is the intentional avoidance of critical thinking. I have to clarify this point.
Yes, sir, and negative capability.
Oh, negative capability. Okay. So first, let me tell you about the willing suspension of disbelief. In fact, that is in fact a technical term that sometimes intentional avoidance of critical thinking or logic in examining something surreal, such as the work of speculative fiction, in order to believe it or sake of enjoyment. So many of the Coleridge poems will find he called for willing suspension of disbelief for the moment, which consists, in fact, because they employed it to constitute poetic faith. So I'd like to once again say that it is the intentional avoidance of critical thinking or logic in examining something surreal, such as a work of speculative fiction. Again, negative capability. Again, the meaning of negative capability, in fact, is again related to theory. That this theory, in fact, is particularly related to John Keats. John Keats, in fact, he propounded this theory of negative capability about the artist's access to truth. In fact, artist's access to truth without the presence and framework of logic or science. So, negative capability, again, you will find that a writer's ability, which you can say that, which successes, in fact, even if you go for, in fact, the William Shakespeare, he possessed this a writer's ability which Shakespeare possessed to enormously, like to accept, undermine, like mysterious doubts without an irritable reaching after fact and reason. So this is that without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. And this thing, according to John Keats, who is negative capability. So negative capability is the objective and emotionally detached, as opposed to one who writes for deductive purposes. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, sir. We have thus come to the end of the session. And all I can say is that, sir, it was really one word which comes on my mind now is flawless. Because the way you deliberated and explicated each and every term, each and every idea, concept in association to postmodernism, it was really a job well done on your part. It was really commendable effort from your side. Because we all know it is quite tough in the sense that we don't get to find anything specific in terms of ideas, but then you try to, in a way, give us a proper framework as such. And so, really, thanks to you. It was really a good job on your part.
Thank you.
And to my dear participants, you will be receiving the feedback form after half an hour at the end of this lecture. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much.